Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Darkest Dungeon guide. This guide will be focused on non-combat related mechanics, tips, and suggestions to hopefully increase your odds of succeeding in the Darkest Dungeon while lowering the costs in terms of body count and gold. Let's start with the very basics. When you first start out the new Hamlet, your top priority should be upgrading your stagecoach up to 4 heroes a week. This will give you a nice amount of heroes to choose from and hopefully be able to better optimize your roster, as well as giving you better choices in terms of heroes with better positive quirks and less bad negative quirks, while also opening up a higher flavor of skills to choose from, which, until you progress your Hamlet further, you won't really be able to change until upgrading the guild and the blacksmith. Speaking of the guild and the blacksmith, once you're done upgrading your stagecoach up to 4 heroes a week, you should start putting your heirlooms towards upgrading the guild and the blacksmith. The purpose of this is to allow your heroes to upgrade their skills while also upgrading their weapons and armor. Now, generally speaking, many people don't quite know which is better. Do I want to use my gold and do I want to use my heirlooms on upgrading the blacksmith, and then allowing my characters to increase their damage, crit, speed, dodge, and health? Or do I instead want to upgrade the guild with my available resources and allow my characters to upgrade their skills? Now, this is just my personal opinion, but it really comes down to the heroes that you're using. For example, a plague doctor, if I have one, yes. A plague doctor relies on, obviously, blight, poisons. So, in this scenario, increasing the plague doctor's weapon, thus giving her more damage, doesn't really benefit her that much, considering that her offensive abilities that deal blight damage and negative status effects have enormous negative damage modifications on them. Minus 90%, minus 80%. So the difference between a level 1 weapon and a level 5 weapon is really not that significant. That being said, weapons are still useful considering that they increase the crit chance and the speed of the hero. However, when it comes down to heroes like plague doctors, vestals, and even houndmasters, which again on some of their more premium abilities have very hefty damage modifications, upgrading the skills themselves may benefit you more than upgrading the weapons. The reason for that is because, for example, upgrading the Plague Doctor's Noxious Blast from level 1 to level 3 brings the blight damage from 4 to 5. And bringing the Noxious Blast from level 3 to 5 would further increase the blight damage from 5 to 6 per round, as well as increasing the crit chance and the blight chance, and the accuracy. So all in all, upgrading the skills on heroes that rely on abilities that don't have too much of an flat damage, not quite sure how I'd want to approach that sentence. The difference, for example, let's put it this way, the difference between a Crusader's Smite and a Plague Doctor's Noxious Blast is very, very significant. The Plague Doctor's Noxious Blast relies on accuracy to hit, and then blight chance in order to hopefully proc the blight status effect, as well as increasing the damage of the ability itself, which can only be done through, well, the majority of the damage can only be increased by upgrading the skill itself. Upgrading the weapon will simply increase the damage from the initial impact of the Noxious Blast bomb. The Crusader's Smite, however, does not gain any increased damage percentage or modification with additional levels. The only things that change are additional crit chance, additional accuracy, and additional damage against Unholy. Meaning that against a large majority of the enemies in the Darkest Dungeon, which are not Unholy, you really won't see any significant damage difference between level 1 Smite and level 5 Smite in terms of skill levels. However, heroes like the Crusader, the Leper, the Abomination benefit greatly from increased weapon levels, considering that their skills don't have any secondary status effects like Blight, Bleed, and somewhat Stuns, which further allows you to benefit more from the damage due to the low damage modifications, or the low negative damage modifications. For example, Rage and Smite have no damage modification, whereas Zealous Accusation and Rake have only minus 40% damage modification. What this means is that increasing the weapon damage feels a lot more impactful on the Abomination rather than it would, for example, on the Vestal, the Jester, or the Plague Doctor. That being said, if money allows you to do so, by all means, feel free to upgrade both the weapons, armors, and the skills as well of any particular character, since the better stats your character has, the more better the better it is. The more likely it is to perform better in the dungeons. Now, when it comes down to the skill selection on your heroes, think about where you want them to go and what you want them to do. For example, a Vestal may very well be able to provide backline support and backline damage by targeting the enemy's back row with Judgment, and up to the 3rd rank with Dazzling Light, allowing you to stun enemies on turns that you don't need to heal your allies using the Vestal. Excuse me. However, the Vestal's main role should, generally speaking, be to be the healer. Now, that doesn't mean that she can't do anything else. For example, she can always deal damage with Judgment. Mind you, her damage is not as high as other characters, but Judgment, with only 20% negative damage modification and 7% crit, is still a pretty darn strong ability to use when you're trying to damage the enemy's back row or front row in some scenarios, and eliminate enemies faster. Dazzling Light, however, in this particular Vestal's role, would probably be your bread and butter, considering that the heals kind of come off as obvious, but Dazzling Light will allow you to stun an enemy, essentially, if the stun is successful, taking him out of the round in particular, allowing for the enemy to essentially take no action. So assume you eliminate no enemies, but you at least manage to stun one, you'll only be having to deal with 3 enemies in particular that turn. Other heroes, for example, may benefit more from being your frontline or offensive heroes, while still maintaining some sort of utility with either Battle Heal or Inspiring Cry. I personally prefer Inspiring Cry because I, generally speaking, take some sort of a healer with me, so Battle Heal kind of loses its how do I put it? It's not as glorified as it would be in a party that has no healer. Whereas Inspiring Cry allows the Crusader to do one of the things that he does best outside of being a frontliner damage dealer, and that is stress management, as well as torch management in some scenarios. So essentially what you might want to consider is, will I be able to eliminate this enemy without the aid of the Crusader's action this turn? By opening up the Crusader to not having to use Smite or Zealous Accusation or Holy Lands, you may, for example, be able to recover 10 stress from an ally or the Crusader himself, of course, if the round permits to do so. Other characters you may be able to shift around in terms of their role. For example, and this is a very unique situation, but I'll share it anyway. During a particular party combination that I used to run with the occultist, where I had 2 houndmasters, in a scenario where the whole party did not need any sort of healing from the weird reconstruction, what I would do is send the occultist into more of a second position role, allowing him to use Hands from the Abyss as well as a trinket that further increases stun and debuff chance, and thus not need to rely on word reconstruction and abyssal artillery. This allowed both of my houndmasters to sit in the back 2 rows and stress heal very often, thus allowing the team that did not need healing, as mentioned, from the occultist's heal, to then be allowed to recover lots of stress. So again, if gold permits to do so, and you can foresee a scenario where you may want to consider switching the roles or positions of certain heroes during the middle of the dungeon, don't be afraid to purchase an additional skill and max it out or get it to the level that you can manage to do so. Because at the end of the day, it's better to have it not needed than need it not have it. That, generally speaking, also applies with provisioning. I personally enjoy taking a very large assortment of provisions. That may be a little excessive, but a large assortment of provisions, and generally speaking, at the very least, one of every sort of provision that can interact with curio, save for the runes. In the runes, you do not have any curios that interact with the anti-venom or bandages, so you wouldn't necessarily want to take any of those in there unless you were for some reason concerned about blight or bleed, which, if you're dealing with the Prophet mini-boss, may be something to consider. I don't want to spoil too much here. Other locations, however, will require a different assortment of provisions, or different amounts of provisions. So that may be something to consider. Just as a quick note, the Cove, for example, requires extra medicinal herbs and extra shovels, considering that you have a very large amount of curios there that could interact with both the medicinal herbs and the shovels. And that's just one example from the current locations. Once the Darkest Dungeon comes out in 3 weeks, we may need to completely set up provisions differently for that particular dungeon, but we'll get to that when we do. Anyway, let's get back to the Hamlet. Once we're done upgrading the stagecoach and taking care of the guild and blacksmith, you may want to consider starting to put your heirlooms towards either the abbey or the tavern. I, generally speaking, try to avoid putting focusing both at the same time, and instead prefer to go for either the abbey or the tavern and specifically focus just one particular type of stress healing. Yes, if one of my characters, say, won't go into the brothel or is not allowed in there or refuses to pray, in that scenario I simply end up going with the less economic and upgraded option. But generally speaking, I found that dumping most of my heirlooms into one particular stress healing type ends up being better in the long run, considering that you can start putting characters that, say, need to recover 90 stress into the penance hall, which can recover up to 100 stress for the same cost that you would otherwise pay for the transept. It's how do I put it? It's a tricky way to explain it, really. This one's more do it at your own preference, but again, I just wanted to share my personal preference when it comes down to upgrading the stress recovery methods in town. I generally focus one location and one particular type, and as I said, if one of them refuses to go into the penance hall or the cloister, I simply use another location, either at that point, either in the abbey or the tavern. It doesn't matter too much. Now, the reason I focus one and not both is because while one would use portraits and the other one would use busts, both end up using crests. As a matter of fact, everything in the Hamlet uses crests. So while you may have a very large amount of portraits and busts, you may be very limited on crests. So you may want to consider selecting one particular location and sticking to it. When it comes down to the sanitarium, you may want to consider upgrading either your treatment library or your medical devices and put the focus on those particular locations. You may choose to upgrade both, but I personally found that upgrading one or the other allows me to do one of two things. In the scenario of upgrading the medical devices, it allows me to remove diseases with greater chance of success for multiple disease cures. So if one has rabies and syphilis, and I try to recover rabies, I have a chance of also removing syphilis at the cost of essentially one single disease, while also decreasing the cost of curing diseases to begin with. However, in a scenario where you might want to decide to upgrade the treatment library first and put most of your focus on there, what it would allow you to do is, in those rare opportunities in the early game where you get that incredibly useful quirk, such as Unerring on a ranged character that increases all ranged skill damage by 10%, or Slugger, which if I recall, Slugger, if I recall, increases damage by 10%, Precise Striker increases crit chance of melee by 3%, and I'm trying to remember what the Eagle Eye, there we go. Eagle Eye increases the crit chance of ranged skills by 3%. If you end up getting those particular quirks on heroes of the appropriate class, having additional points in the treatment library ends up allowing you to lock in quirks for a far, far cheaper price, up to 50% less cost. So for example, for a level 0 character, instead of paying a whopping 7,500 gold, you pay 3,750, and in the early game, that is a very, very large amount to remove. At the very, very end, you may want to go back into the stagecoach, finish upgrading it. You may choose to upgrade the barracks and the stagecoach network a little bit further throughout your weeks in the Hamlet, but once you get that roster to maybe tier 1 or tier 2 and the stagecoach network to tier 2 or 3, you may want to hold off on upgrading the last few tiers, since if I recall correctly, the blacksmith also uses deeds and crests. It's either the blacksmith or the guild also uses deeds and crests. So essentially the resources will have to be shared between the stagecoach or the blacksmith. And at the end of the day, the blacksmith and guild take precedence over the stagecoach once you got those first couple of tiers and the upgrades in. Lastly comes the Nomad Wagon and the Survivalist. The Survivalist's quirks, the Survivalist's upgrade tree doesn't really need to be focused that much. It can honestly be upgraded last. At the end of the day, upgrading, it costs a little. Oh shit! I thought there was going to be a confirmation, but I guess that doesn't hurt. It doesn't cost too much, even at level with no upgrades. But at the end of the day, unless a character desperately needs a particular camping skill because it's an excellent camping skill, for example, most of the Man-at-Arms camping skills are incredibly good, you may want to end up dumping that extra 1,500 gold in there, or however much it costs to get that upgrade, and using your the Survivalist and Nomad Wagon will only exclusively use crests, meaning that the cost of upgrading the wagon size, the merchant network, and the Survivalists, and reducing the Survivalists' costs, end up using a tremendous amount of crests, which kind of limits you to really be able to upgrade these two locations last. At the end of it all, you gotta end up asking yourself a couple of questions. When you get a new character, ask yourself, how good are the quirks that this character currently has? If they're decent, keep it. If they're bad, you can always pick the character up and just dismiss it without you ever bringing it into a dungeon if you need the roster slot. But better to have a character and not need it than need it and not have it. And that should really be one of your mottos. I know it's mine. It should be one of your mottos while you're playing this game. Any particular skill, any particular camping skill, any particular combat skill, any particular trinket even. It's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. One more thing regarding trinkets, and I'm not talking about which trinkets to take with you on particular heroes or in particular dungeons. What I'm gonna say is this. When you're collecting trinkets in the dungeons, keep in mind that especially when you're starting to look at the more rare varieties, so uncommons, rares, very rares, and obviously ancestrals, they sell for a lot. So for example, if you have the option of picking up a very rare trinket and you have no slots in your inventory and one of the slots is occupied by 1,500 gold, get rid of that gold. Pick up the trinket. Even if you don't need the trinket, once you get to town, you can sell that trinket for a much greater amount of gold than you would otherwise have gotten from that slot of 1,500 gold. So a way I look at my income from dungeons when I complete them is not just, from all the rubies, sapphires, topazes, and gold I got, but I also look at trinkets. They don't show up on the end screen, but keep it in the back of your mind. You say, oh wait, I found a rare and a very rare trinket that I don't need, so if I need to, I can sell them for something like 5,000 or 6,000 gold. Don't be afraid of selling trinkets. Remember, you can always find more trinkets in the dungeon, especially if they're some of the quote-unquote less stellar trinkets. Excuse me. So, don't think that you have to hoard trinkets. Don't be afraid to sell them, because let me just really quickly show you. On this particular save, if I recall, that is what, week 19? Week 18, yeah, so we're on week 19 right now, and as you can tell, I barely have any trinkets. It's not because I haven't found any, but it's because I sell a very large portion of the trinkets. So, again, any trinkets I don't really see any significant use for, I just go ahead and get rid of them. And instead turn them into cash that I can then use to buy upgrades and weapons for my characters. Anyway, I think that is it. I can't think of too much else to share with you. So I appreciate you checking out the video. I hope that this video helped you out, and I hope that you have good luck and a fun time in the Darkest Dungeon. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.